Hashtag the crown's hidden secrets. Prince Alexander stood at the tall windows of Raven's Hollow Palace, watching the morning mist roll across the ancient gardens. At 28, he carried himself with the practiced grace expected of the heir to the throne of Elder Mir. But today his usual composure seemed strained. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there were shadows under his green eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. The heavy oak door behind him creaked open, and his younger sister Princess Victoria entered without ceremony. At 25, she possessed a sharp intelligence that often put court officials on edge and a rebellious streak that gave their father, King Edmund, constant headaches. "You look terrible," Victoria said bluntly, settling into one of the antique chairs near the fireplace. "Have you been sleeping at all?" Alexander turned from the window, his jaw tight. "Sleep is a luxury I can't afford right now." He moved to his desk, where several official documents lay scattered. "Have you seen the morning papers?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "I make it a point to avoid them. Nothing good ever comes from reading what they write about our family." She paused, studying her brother's expression. "But I'm guessing this is different. The Herald is running a story about Father and Duchess Isabel." Alexander's voice was carefully controlled, but Victoria could hear the anger underneath. "They're calling it the secret romance that rocks the palace." Victoria's face darkened. Their father had been widowed for 3 years since their mother, Queen Catherine, had died in a tragic riding accident. The entire kingdom had mourned with him, and his grief had seemed genuine and deep. But 6 months ago, rumors had begun circulating about his relationship with Duchess Isabel Montrose, a striking woman in her early 40s who had recently joined the court as a cultural advisor. "How bad is it?" Victoria asked quietly. Alexander picked up the newspaper from his desk and read aloud. "Sources close to the palace reveal that King Edmund's relationship with the mysterious Duchess has been ongoing for over a year, possibly beginning while Queen Catherine was still alive. Palace insiders describe secret meetings, expensive gifts, and a level of intimacy that has shocked even the most seasoned courtiers." "That's impossible," Victoria said immediately. "Father loved Mother completely. Anyone could see that. I know that, and you know that, but the public doesn't know that." Alexander threw the paper down in frustration. "They're painting him as an adulterer who dishonored Mother's memory." The article goes on to describe how Duchess Isabel has allegedly been manipulating Father, influencing his decisions, and positioning herself to become the next queen. Victoria stood up abruptly and began pacing. "This has to be orchestrated. Someone is deliberately trying to damage Father's reputation and destabilize the monarchy." "But who?" Before Alexander could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Lord Chancellor Harrison entered, his usually impeccable appearance showing signs of strain. At 62, Harrison had served the crown for over 30 years and had never looked as worried as he did at that moment. "Your Royal Highness," he addressed Alexander with a formal bow. "Princess Victoria, we have a situation that requires immediate attention." "We're aware of the newspaper article," Alexander said. "We need to issue a statement denying these allegations and defending His Majesty's honor." Harrison's expression grew even more grave. "I'm afraid it's more complicated than that. The Duchess Isabel has requested an urgent private audience with you, Your Highness. She claims to have information that could either destroy or save the monarchy." Victoria and Alexander exchanged glances. "What kind of information?" Victoria asked. She wouldn't say over the phone, but she seemed genuinely distressed. "She's waiting in the blue drawing room." Harrison paused. "There's something else. Prime Minister Blackwood has called for an emergency meeting this afternoon. The Parliament is already discussing the implications of these allegations for the stability of the government." The weight of the situation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Alexander had always known that one day he would face a crisis that would test his ability to lead, but he had never imagined it would involve his father's personal life and his mother's memory. "Where's Father now?" Alexander asked. "His Majesty is in his private chambers. He's refused to see anyone since the story broke this morning. His secretary says he's been there since dawn, and no one has been able to convince him to come out." Alexander made his decision quickly. Victoria, come with me to meet with Duchess Isabel. Lord Harrison, please try to reach father and arrange a family meeting for this evening. We need to hear his side of this story and decide how to respond as a united front. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the blue drawing room, Victoria grabbed her brother's arm. Alex, what if some of it is true? Not the part about mother, but what if father has been seeing the Duchess longer than we thought? What if he's been keeping secrets from us? Alexander stopped walking and looked at his sister seriously. Then we deal with it. But we deal with it as a family, and we protect the crown. Whatever is happening here, someone is trying to use it to bring down everything our family has built for centuries. The blue drawing room was one of the most formal spaces in the palace, with its silk-covered walls and priceless paintings. Duchess Isabel stood with her back to the door, looking out at the palace gardens. She was an elegant woman with auburn hair and intelligent blue eyes, and she had always carried herself with quiet dignity. Today, however, she seemed fragile and uncertain. "Your Royal Highness," she said, turning and curtsying as Alexander and Victoria entered. "Princess Victoria, thank you for seeing me so quickly." "Duchess," Alexander replied formally. "Lord Harrison said you have information about the current situation." Isabel's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in front of her. "I need you to understand that I never intended for any of this to happen. Your father is a good man who has been grieving deeply since your mother's death. My relationship with him has been entirely proper and above board." "Then explain the allegations in the newspaper," Victoria said, her voice sharp. "They're lies, but they're clever lies based on small truths." Isabel moved to sit in one of the chairs, and Alexander and Victoria followed suit. "It's true that I've spent time with His Majesty, but always in official capacities. We've discussed cultural programs, charity initiatives, and ways to modernize certain aspects of the monarchy while respecting tradition." "But," Alexander prompted, sensing there was more. "But someone has been watching us very carefully and documenting our meetings. They've taken photographs of us talking in private, walking together in the gardens, and sharing moments that, while completely innocent, could be misinterpreted by someone with malicious intent." Isabel's voice grew stronger as she continued. "More importantly, I believe I know who is behind this." Victoria leaned forward. "Who?" "Duke Richard Ashworth." Alexander felt his blood run cold. Duke Richard was his father's younger brother, next in line to the throne after Alexander himself. Richard had always harbored resentment about being the second son, and there had been tension between the brothers for years. "Uncle Richard?" Victoria's voice was disbelieving. "But he's family. Family members can be the most dangerous enemies," Isabel said quietly. "Duke Richard has been asking very specific questions about my relationship with your father. He's also been meeting secretly with several members of Parliament who have been vocal about wanting to limit the monarchy's power." Alexander stood up and began pacing, his mind racing. If Uncle Richard is behind this, then it's not just about damaging father's reputation. He's positioning himself to take the throne. "But that's impossible," Victoria protested. "Even if something happened to father, Alex is the heir. Unless Alex is deemed unfit to rule because he failed to protect the monarchy during a crisis," Isabel said softly. "Or unless questions arise about his loyalty to the crown if he supports his father through this scandal." The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow. His uncle wasn't just trying to destroy his father. He was trying to eliminate the entire line of succession that stood between him and the crown. "Do you have any proof of Duke Richard's involvement?" Alexander asked. Isabel reached into her purse and pulled out a small recording device. 2 days ago, he approached me with an offer. He said he could make all the rumors go away if I agreed to publicly confirm that I had an inappropriate relationship with your father and then disappear quietly. When I refused, he became threatening. She pressed play, and Duke Richard's voice filled the room. His tone was smooth, but menacing as he outlined his plan to use Isabel to bring down King Edmund and position himself as the stable alternative the country needed. Victoria's face was white with shock. He's planning a coup. A legal one, Alexander said grimly. If Parliament loses confidence in Father and questions my ability to lead during this crisis, they could potentially force a change in succession. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Lord Harrison entered, looking even more troubled than before. Your Highness, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there have been developments. His Majesty has agreed to see you, but only you, and only for 5 minutes. Also, Duke Richard has called a press conference for this evening. He's planning to make a statement about the current situation. Alexander felt the walls closing in around him. In a matter of hours, his family's centuries-old legacy could be destroyed by carefully orchestrated lies and manipulation. But he also felt a steely determination rising within him. He was the heir to the throne of Eldermere, and he would not let his uncle destroy everything his parents had worked to build. Lord Harrison, I need you to do several things immediately, he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had learned from years of preparation for leadership. First, arrange for palace security to discreetly monitor Duke Richard's movements and communications. Second, contact our allies in Parliament and brief them on what we've learned. Third, prepare a legal team to review the evidence Duchess Isabel has provided. He turned to Isabel. Duchess, I need you to remain in the palace for your own protection. If my uncle is willing to orchestrate this level of deception, I don't want to risk what he might do if he feels cornered. Finally, he looked at his sister. Victoria, I need you to coordinate with our media advisors. We're going to get ahead of Uncle Richard's press conference with one of our own. As Lord Harrison and Duchess Isabel left to carry out their instructions, Victoria grabbed her brother's arm again. Alex, what are you planning? I'm planning to save our father, expose Uncle Richard, and protect the crown, he said simply. But first, I need to talk to Father and make sure he understands what we're really facing. The walk to King Edmund's private chambers felt like the longest of Alexander's life. Everything he had been trained for, everything he believed in, everything his family represented hung in the balance. As he approached his father's door, he could only hope that the man who had raised him to be a future king would find the strength to be the king his country needed right now. The future of the monarchy and everything Alexander held dear depended on the next few hours. Hashtag the King's Confession. King Edmund looked far older than his 55 years as he sat in his favorite armchair, still wearing the same clothes he had put on before dawn. His usually neat silver hair was disheveled, and his eyes held a pain that went deeper than the current crisis. The private chambers that had once been his sanctuary with Queen Catherine now felt like a prison. Alexander entered quietly, noting how his father's shoulders sagged with the weight of accusation and grief. The room still held traces of his mother's presence in the carefully chosen artwork and soft furnishings that had been her personal touches. Father, Alexander said gently, taking a seat across from him. We need to talk. King Edmund looked up, and Alexander saw the deep exhaustion in his father's eyes. I suppose you've seen the papers. I suppose the whole world now believes their king is an adulterer who betrayed the memory of his beloved wife. I know you didn't betray Mother, Alexander said firmly. But I also know that someone is using your relationship with Duchess Isabel to destroy our family. We have evidence that Uncle Richard is behind this. The king's eyes sharpened slightly. Richard? What evidence? Alexander quickly explained what Duchess Isabel had revealed, including the recording of Duke Richard's threats. As he spoke, he watched his father's expression change from despair to anger to grim determination. I should have seen this coming, King Edmund said quietly. Richard has always resented that I inherited the crown. When your mother died, and I was at my lowest point, he was so helpful, so supportive. I thought he was genuinely trying to help his grieving brother. Tell me about Duchess Isabel, Alexander said. The truth, father. All of it. King Edmund was quiet for a long moment, then began to speak in a voice heavy with emotion. When your mother died, I wanted to die with her. For months, I could barely function. Richard suggested that bringing in a cultural advisor might help me refocus on my duties to the kingdom. Isabel came with impeccable credentials and recommendations. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where he and Queen Catherine had spent countless happy hours. At first, our relationship was purely professional. She helped me plan cultural events, worked on charity initiatives, advised me on ways to connect with younger citizens. But gradually, I began to look forward to our meetings. Not because of any romantic feelings, but because she was one of the few people who could help me remember how to care about something again. Alexander listened carefully, hearing the pain in his father's voice. When did the rumors start? About 6 months ago. At first, they were just whispers among the staff. I thought would blow over, but they kept growing. I should have addressed them immediately, but I was afraid that denying them too forcefully would only make people more suspicious. King Edmund turned back to his son. I never imagined someone would twist our professional relationship into something sordid for political gain. Father, I need to ask you directly. Have you ever had romantic feelings for Duchess Isabel? King Edmund met his son's eyes without hesitation. No, she's an intelligent, attractive woman, and under different circumstances, perhaps things might have developed differently. But Catherine was the love of my life. The idea that I could dishonor her memory by pursuing another woman so soon after her death is almost physically painful to me. Alexander felt a wave of relief, mixed with renewed anger at his uncle's manipulation. Then we fight back. We expose Uncle Richard for what he is and clear your name. It's not that simple, King Edmund said wearily. Even if we prove Richard orchestrated this, the damage to the monarchy's reputation may be irreversible. The people need to trust their king completely. If they have any doubt about my character or judgment, it undermines everything. Before Alexander could respond, there was an urgent knock at the door. Victoria entered without waiting for permission, her face flushed with excitement and worry. Father, Alex, you need to see this immediately. She was holding her phone, and Alexander could see a news video playing. Uncle Richard just gave an interview to Channel 7 News. He's not waiting for his scheduled press conference. She turned up the volume, and Duke Richard's voice filled the room. On screen, he sat in what appeared to be his private study, looking every inch the concerned royal family member. I'm deeply saddened to have to address these allegations about my brother, Richard was saying, his voice heavy with apparent regret. King Edmund is grieving, and I believe his judgment has been severely compromised by his relationship with Duchess Isabel. As someone who loves both my brother and this kingdom, I feel compelled to speak out. Victoria fast-forwarded through some of the interview. He gets worse. Listen to this part. Richard's voice continued. The monarchy must be above reproach. If there is any question about the king's moral authority, it affects the stability of our entire government. I'm not calling for my brother's abdication, but I do think the royal family needs to seriously consider whether temporary measures should be taken to restore public confidence. King Edmund's face had gone pale. Temporary measures? Alexander's jaw was clenched with fury. He's positioning himself as the reluctant family member who has to step in to save the monarchy from scandal. It's exactly what Duchess Isabel warned us about. The phone in Alexander's pocket buzzed with an urgent call. It was Lord Harrison. Your Highness. Harrison's voice was tight with stress. You need to return to the main palace immediately. Prime Minister Blackwood is here with several senior ministers, and they're requesting an emergency meeting with you. Parliament is considering calling for a vote of no confidence in His Majesty's ability to rule effectively. Alexander felt the world shifting beneath his feet. In a matter of hours, his uncle's plan was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. We'll be right there. He ended the call and looked at his father and sister. This is it. Parliament is making their move. King Edmund straightened his shoulders, and Alexander saw a glimpse of the strong leader who had guided Eldermere through economic challenges and international crises. Then we make ours. Alexander, I want you to call your own press conference for tonight. You're going to tell the truth about everything we've discovered. Father, that could be dangerous. If we're wrong about Uncle Richard, or if we can't prove everything we suspect, we're not wrong, Victoria interrupted. I've been doing some digging while you two were talking. She pulled out a tablet and showed them a series of financial records. Uncle Richard has been making significant payments to several tabloid journalists over the past year. The money trail leads back to a shell company he controls. Alexander studied the documents. How did you get these? Victoria smiled grimly. Let's just say that being the rebellious princess who everyone underestimates has its advantages. People tend to forget that I studied economics and international finance before the palace convinced me to focus on charity work. King Edmund looked at his daughter with new respect. What else did you find? Uncle Richard has been meeting regularly with Lord Pembroke and Lord Ashford, two of Parliament's most vocal critics of the monarchy. They've been planning this for months, maybe longer. The newspaper story was just the trigger they were waiting for. Alexander's phone buzzed again with a text message from an unknown number. He read it aloud. If you want to save your father's throne, meet me at the old chapel at midnight. Come alone. A friend. That's obviously a trap, Victoria said immediately. Maybe, Alexander agreed. Or maybe it's someone who wants to help, but can't be seen doing it publicly. King Edmund stood up decisively. Alexander, go meet with the Prime Minister. Find out exactly what Parliament is planning and how much time we have. Victoria continued digging into Richard's activities. I want to know everything about his plans and his co-conspirators. What are you going to do? Alexander asked. I'm going to talk to Duchess Isabel again, and then I'm going to prepare for the fight of my life. King Edmund's voice had regained its royal authority. Your uncle may think he can destroy everything I've built, but he's forgotten that I didn't become king by being weak. As they prepared to leave the private chambers, Victoria grabbed both her father and brother's arms. Whatever happens, we face it together. We're a family, and we protect each other. Alexander nodded, feeling the weight of his future crown, but also the strength that came from knowing his family would stand with him. Together, the walk to the main palace felt like marching into battle. In the distance, Alexander could see news vans gathering outside the palace gates, and he knew that by tomorrow, the entire world would be watching to see if the monarchy of Eldermere would survive its greatest crisis in generations. Prime Minister Blackwood was waiting in the formal meeting room with 3 senior ministers and the Attorney General. His usually jovial demeanor was replaced by the serious expression of a man who understood the gravity of the constitutional crisis they were facing. Your Royal Highness, Blackwood stood as Alexander entered. Thank you for meeting with us on such short notice. I'm afraid we have some very serious matters to discuss. Alexander took his seat at the head of the table, unconsciously adopting the posture and presence he had been trained to use in formal situations. Prime Minister, ministers, please speak freely. I want to understand exactly what Parliament is considering and what options we're facing. Attorney General Morrison leaned forward. Your Highness, based on the allegations in today's newspapers and Duke Richard's public statements, several members of Parliament are questioning whether His Majesty can continue to serve effectively as head of state. They're concerned that the scandal will undermine public confidence in the monarchy and, by extension, the stability of our government. What specific actions are being proposed? Alexander asked, keeping his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. There are several possibilities being discussed, Prime Minister Blackwood said carefully. The most moderate proposal would be for His Majesty to take a temporary leave of absence while these allegations are investigated. During that time, you would serve as regent. And the less moderate proposals? Morrison exchanged glances with the other ministers before answering. Some are calling for His Majesty's abdication in your favor. A few extreme voices are even suggesting that this crisis demonstrates the need to transition to a fully Republican government. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. Prime Minister, what do you believe? Blackwood was quiet for a moment before responding. Your Highness, I've served under your father for 8 years. He's been an exemplary monarch who has always put the good of the kingdom before his personal interests. I find it very difficult to believe the allegations against him. But, Alexander prompted, but the political reality is that perception often matters more than truth in these situations. If the public loses confidence in the monarchy, it could destabilize our entire system of government. We need to find a way to restore that confidence quickly. Minister Davidson, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Your Highness, there's another factor to consider. Duke Richard has significant support among certain members of Parliament. If he were to put himself forward as an alternative during a regency period, Alexander understood immediately. You're saying that Uncle Richard could use a regency as an opportunity to position himself as a permanent replacement for my father. It's a possibility we can't ignore, Morrison confirmed. Alexander made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him just hours earlier. Gentlemen, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential until I can present evidence publicly. We have reason to believe that Duke Richard has orchestrated this entire scandal in an attempt to seize the throne. He quickly outlined what they had discovered about Richard's payments to journalists and his threats against Duchess Isabel. The ministers listened with growing shock and concern. If what you're saying is true, Prime Minister Blackwood said slowly, then we're not dealing with a scandal about the king's personal life. We're dealing with an attempted coup. Exactly. Alexander leaned forward. I need 24 hours to gather definitive proof and present it publicly. Can Parliament wait that long before taking any formal action? The ministers exchanged glances. Finally, Blackwood nodded. I think I can convince the leadership to delay any votes for 24 hours. But, Your Highness, if you can't provide compelling evidence of Duke Richard's involvement, the pressure for immediate action will become irresistible. As the meeting concluded and the ministers left, Alexander remained in the formal meeting room, staring out at the gathering dusk. In less than 24 hours, he would either save his father's throne or watch centuries of tradition crumble under the weight of lies and ambition. His phone buzzed with another message from the same unknown number, the chapel. Midnight. This is your only chance to learn the truth about what really happened to your mother. Alexander stared at the message, his blood running cold. What did his mother's death have to do with the current crisis? And what truth was someone claiming to know about the riding accident that had taken her life? As darkness fell over Raven's Hollow Palace, Alexander realized that the stakes were even higher than he had imagined. This wasn't just about saving his father's reputation or exposing his uncle's ambitions. This was about uncovering secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. #Midnight Revelations. The ancient chapel stood at the edge of the palace grounds, its Gothic spires reaching into the star-filled night sky. Alexander approached it alone, as the mysterious message had demanded, but not without taking precautions. Victoria was positioned in the palace security center, monitoring his location through a hidden tracking device, and loyal palace guards were stationed discreetly around the perimeter. The chapel had been built 3 centuries earlier by one of Alexander's ancestors, and it held the tombs of generations of Eldermere royalty. His mother was buried here, in a marble tomb beside his grandfather and great-grandfather. The very thought of Queen Catherine made Alexander's chest tighten with grief and renewed determination to protect her memory from his uncle's lies. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, Alexander was surprised to find candles already lit throughout the interior, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. A figure sat in the front pew, facing the altar. As Alexander's footsteps echoed in the sacred space, the person turned around. It was Lord James Hartwell, the former head of palace security who had retired suddenly, just 6 months after Queen Catherine's death. Alexander remembered him as a dedicated, honorable man who had served the royal family faithfully for over 20 years. Your Highness, Hartwell stood and bowed deeply. Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would trust the message. Lord Hartwell, Alexander replied, his surprise evident. I thought you had retired to the countryside. What are you doing here, and why all this secrecy? Hartwell's face was grave, age beyond his 60 years. I left royal service because I discovered something that I couldn't live with, something that your uncle threatened to destroy me over if I ever revealed it. But watching what's happening to your father now, I can't stay silent any longer. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. What did you discover? Hartwell walked closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Your mother's death was not an accident. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He gripped the back of a pew to steady himself, his mind reeling. What are you saying? I'm saying that Queen Catherine was murdered, and Duke Richard was responsible. Alexander's world tilted on its axis. For 3 years, he had grieved his mother's tragic but accidental death. The official investigation had concluded that her horse had been spooked by something in the woods, causing it to rear and throw her against a tree. The head injury had been fatal. That's impossible, Alexander said, though his voice lacked conviction. There was a full investigation. The police, the coroner, everyone agreed it was an accident. Hartwell reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. This contains evidence that I've kept hidden for 3 years. Photographs, documents, witness statements that were never included in the official investigation. Evidence that proves someone deliberately spooked your mother's horse. Alexander took the envelope with trembling hands. Why didn't you reveal this 3 years ago? Because Duke Richard discovered that I was investigating irregularities in the official report. He threatened not just to destroy my career, but to harm my family. My daughter Sarah was only 16 at the time. He made it very clear that if I pursued the matter, she would suffer the consequences. Hartwell's voice was thick with guilt and regret. I was a coward, Your Highness. I chose my family's safety over justice for your mother. Alexander opened the envelope and began examining the contents by candlelight. There were photographs of tire tracks in the woods near where his mother had been riding, tracks that didn't match any of the palace vehicles. There were statements from stable hands who had noticed someone near the horses on the morning of her death, someone who didn't belong there. Most damning of all, there was a laboratory report showing that traces of a chemical compound had been found on the Queen's horse, a compound that would cause extreme agitation and panic in animals. Who else knows about this? Alexander asked, his voice hollow with shock and growing fury. Only my former assistant, Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, who helped me gather this evidence. She left the police force shortly after the official investigation concluded. She couldn't live with the cover-up either, but she was threatened as well. Hartwell paused. There's something else, Your Highness. The person who was seen near the horses that morning matches the description of Thomas Whitmore, one of Duke Richard's personal assistants. Alexander's hands clenched into fists as the full scope of his uncle's evil became clear. Richard hadn't just orchestrated the current scandal to seize the throne. He had murdered Alexander's mother 3 years earlier to accelerate his path to power. Why kill her? Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Your mother was investigating Duke Richard's financial dealings. She had discovered that he was embezzling money from several royal charities and selling information about palace security to foreign interests. She planned to present evidence to your father that would have resulted in Richard being stripped of his titles and exiled from the kingdom. Alexander felt sick. His beloved mother, who had always been so devoted to her charitable work, had died because she tried to protect the institutions she served. And his father had spent 3 years grieving the loss of his wife, never knowing that his own brother had murdered her. We have to tell my father, Alexander said. We have to expose all of this. Your Highness, if we reveal this now, Duke Richard will know that someone has evidence of his crimes. He's already demonstrated that he's willing to kill to protect his secrets. Your life, your father's life, Princess Victoria's life, all of you are in danger. Alexander's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Victoria. Alex, you need to get back to the palace now. Uncle Richard is here with a legal team, and they're demanding an immediate meeting with Father. Something's happening. Lord Hartwell, come with me, Alexander said urgently. We need to present this evidence to my father before Uncle Richard can do whatever he's planning. As they hurried from the chapel toward the palace, Alexander's mind was racing. His uncle wasn't just planning a political coup. He was preparing to eliminate the entire direct line of succession by whatever means necessary. The current scandal was just the beginning. They reached the palace to find it in controlled chaos. Security guards were stationed at every entrance, and Alexander could see several unfamiliar vehicles in the main courtyard. Victoria met them at a side entrance, her face pale but determined. "Alex, thank God you're back." Uncle Richard arrived an hour ago with 3 lawyers and demanded to see Father immediately. He claims he has documents that prove Father is mentally unfit to rule and that he needs to take over as regent immediately. Where are they now? In Father's private study. Uncle Richard insisted on privacy for what he called sensitive family matters. "Alex, I don't like this. Something feels very wrong." Alexander introduced Victoria to Lord Hartwell and quickly explained what he had learned about their mother's murder. Victoria's face went through a series of emotions: shock, grief, rage, and, finally, cold determination. "We need to get a father now," she said. "If Uncle Richard is capable of murder, there's no telling what he might do if he feels cornered." They made their way through the palace corridors, but as they approached King Edmund's private study, they could hear raised voices from within. Alexander pressed his ear to the door and heard his uncle's voice, no longer smooth and diplomatic, but harsh and threatening. "Edmund, you're going to sign these papers, or I'm going to release evidence that will destroy not just your reputation, but Alexander's as well. Evidence of his involvement with radical political groups, his secret gambling debts, his inappropriate relationships. By the time I'm finished, Parliament won't just question your fitness to rule, they'll demand that the entire line of succession be reformed." Alexander's blood boiled. His uncle was threatening to fabricate evidence against him, just as he had orchestrated the lies about Duchess Isabel. His father's voice came through the door, weak but defiant. "I won't let you destroy my son with lies, Richard. I don't care what you do to me. Then, perhaps you'll care what happens to your precious daughter. Victoria has always been so headstrong, so reckless. It would be such a tragedy if she had a riding accident like her dear mother." The threat against Victoria was the final straw. Alexander burst through the door with Victoria and Lord Hartwell behind him, startling the 4 men inside. Duke Richard spun around, his face showing a flash of genuine fear before returning to its practiced mask of calm authority. "Alexander, how convenient," Richard said smoothly. "I was just discussing with your father the need for stable leadership during this difficult time. The only thing we need to discuss is your arrest for the murder of Queen Catherine," Alexander said coldly, holding up the envelope of evidence. For the first time in his life, Alexander saw his uncle's composure completely crack. Richard's face went white, then flushed red with rage and desperation. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Richard snarled. "I've spent years planning for this moment. Years positioning myself to save this kingdom from your father's weakness and your inevitable failures. Catherine was just an obstacle, just like you'll be an obstacle if you don't step aside now." King Edmund stood up slowly, his grief and shock transforming into royal fury. "You killed my wife. You murdered Catherine, and let me believe it was an accident. You let me grieve and blame myself for 3 years. She was going to destroy everything." Richard shouted, all pretense of family loyalty abandoned. "She was going to expose my business arrangements, ruin my relationships with our foreign allies, turn you against me. I couldn't let one sentimental woman destroy decades of careful planning." Alexander stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "Lord Hartwell, please call palace security and have Duke Richard arrested. Victoria, contact the police commissioner and inform him that we're pressing charges for murder, treason, and conspiracy." But Richard wasn't finished. With the desperate fury of a cornered animal, he reached inside his coat. "If I can't have the throne legitimately, then I'll take it by force." The gun appeared so quickly that no one had time to react. Richard pointed it directly at King Edmund, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that split second, Alexander made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He threw himself between the gun and his father just as the shot rang out through the study. The impact spun Alexander around, and he felt fire tear through his shoulder as he crashed to the floor. Through the haze of pain and shock, he could hear Victoria screaming, his father shouting for help, and the sounds of palace guards bursting into the room. As consciousness faded at the edges, Alexander's last clear thought was that he had saved his father's life. The monarchy of Eldermere would survive, his mother's murder would finally be avenged, and his uncle's evil plans would die with his arrest. But the cost of that victory was yet to be determined.